It's really easy to build yourself into a corner with these types of B2B applications. You can say, I'm going to go and build a very clear wedge where I go and address this one problem. And you do a great job at that, and you expand and work with all your customers, and they go up market. And then your best customers come to you and say, hey, actually, we need to churn off of your product because we're going to move on to NetSuite. We're going to move on to some larger system that's going to subsume your system, and we don't really need you anymore. And because you're not that comprehensive platform, there's no reason for us to keep working with this.
Welcome to Blue Ocean by StartOps. In this show, we talk about the problems faced by modern supply chain, logistics, finance, and CX leaders, and the tools and techniques they're using to solve them. Each episode, I sit down with an e-commerce operator or founder at the front lines of operations and try to gather as much information and tactical wisdom from them as possible to share with you. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Cushing, the founder of StartOps. With me here today is Wiley Jones, co-founder and CEO of Doss. Welcome, Wiley.
Hey, Charles. Glad to be here.
We're going to get into Doss in just a second here, but effectively what you guys are doing is taking on the notion of what an ERP is or could be. And in the ops software world, you've gotten a bit of street cred recently for starting the Anti-ERP ERP Club. I can see you repping your swag there right now.
Yes, I can't tell how visible it is in the frame, but maybe it's backwards, but you can kind of see. Yeah.
I'm just so curious, how did the idea for that even come up? It's such a funny but effective way of capturing the essence of what you're trying to do.
I think in short, it was that one, I saw lots of people always wearing the, whatever the actual brand is, like anti-social, social club, right? I saw people wearing those. And then I spent a lot of time living in China. This was years ago. And a lot of times I would see rip off, streetwear, like you'd see Supreme, but with an F, it'd be like Fupreme or something. And I saw people doing that with anti-social social club. And one day I was just looking through some YouTube videos, watching this NetSuite user group. And someone said something really funny in it. It was NetSuite is not sweet or something stupid like that. And I was like, oh yeah, they need a club for all these haters and stuff. And I was there was even the r/ERP, and it's a bunch of people griping and complaining about ERPs and Reddit and stuff. And I was like, I think this would be funny. And I just posted about it, and other people thought it was funny. And so then I just all right, let's just make some hoodies and get a bunch of people together who all think the same things about building systems of record and business process management software. And it turns out there's actually a lot of people who care a lot about this stuff and are genuinely intrigued in it. So it kind of took on a life of its own. Now we do monthly events, and we've got a Slack group, and people who are just, interested in these types of topics spend a lot of time talking about PDF generation and the right way to structure currencies when you're working across multinational corporations and all kinds of fun stuff. So yeah, it's fun.
It's great. I mean, it can be a lonely pursuit, figuring out all the ways that ERPs are bad and trying to make them better. And it's nice that you've created this place where everyone can get together and nerd out. Just to set the context for the whole thing, for people who aren't familiar with Doss, what is the one-liner about what it is and the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah. So the one-liner is, especially when we talk to our customers, today we help businesses manage their operations from purchase order to point of sale. That's as succinct as I can make it. In the long run, though, we think that the footprint of what we can cover as a solution can be much larger. It can look a lot more like data platform work that people today are, a lot of times going and taking large analytics workloads, dumping them into things like Snowflake. But there are a lot of companies that, let's say they manage, multiple points of sale. They have e-commerce footprint, they have a wholesale footprint, a retail footprint. They're doing a bunch of bill pay, a bunch of invoice and automation. They also are connecting out and doing stuff related to tracking customer orders and customer points with Yapto, or they're doing all kinds of customer success stuff inside of Customer or TalkDesk or Gorgeous or Klaviyo for email marketing. And they want to merge all that data together. That no longer looks like just managing your operational footprint. It also starts to look like a data platform that we could start consuming a lot of the workloads that are typically associated with data science and analytics teams and BI teams, and giving that a native connection into the operational data that these people have, which is what is my product catalog? What are the orders that I've fulfilled? What is the status of our procurement of these different sets of, items in our product catalog that we want to be launching later this year? Ends up looking a lot more close to what you would say solutions that are offered by Oracle and SAP and folks like that, or, what's on the market for them today.
That's interesting. And your site, at least last time I looked, the tagline on it was the ERP that was promised. How do you guys think about positioning yourselves against ERP market? Obviously it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. You're building something ultimately quite new, but maybe solving some of the problems that the ERP set out to solve. How do you think about that from a marketing perspective, I guess?
This actually really calls back to what you even pointed out with like Anti-ERP ERP Club. The reason that that's funny is because there's this like kernel of truth inside of it that it's like, I don't want to be that thing, but I am that thing. And it's funny because everyone knows that it has to be true. In order for you to go and deliver real business value, you need to be a system of record that views business logic with rigor and insight on how things should be done. Well, in practice, that is what an ERP is. And that's why lots of companies, when they go public and they go and build, financial controls that allow them to be a functioning multi-billion-dollar business, they do go and implement those systems. At a certain scale, you cannot be a successful company without making really opinionated decisions on how you create rigor in the information architecture of like your operations, your bookkeeping, your budgeting, your headcount planning, your whatever it is. All we're trying to do is say we are very similar to the mission and goals of what was stated from ERP all the way back to the 1980s and 1990s when it really started to take off. But we are not like in the ways that they are all cumbersome, the way that they are all extremely difficult to implement, that the incentives for implementation are not aligned with the business's actual objectives, that once you've implemented it into integrators and partners that are going to bill you for your time, luck getting someone to understand something when like their paycheck is tied to them not understanding it. Those are the kinds of things where, you got to be aware of what you're getting into. And so when we think about being an ERP, we want to take the pieces that people like out of it and hold on to those, but the pieces that people don't like and try to distance ourselves from them. I think that's a pretty simple answer from our perspective. And a lot of people who are critical of that, they're like, well, you can't have one without the other. I think there is a way. And philosophically, that's something that we really try to get across to our customers.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's a wildly ambitious vision, right? Because same problem, different solution, but it's a really hard problem. You've got some really interesting philosophies and insights about what needs to be true for a product like this to work and how you plan to sort of stage out your growth. Before we get to that, though, I want to just kind of reel back a little bit to your background. How did you get to this point? I guess going back as far as you need to, in your own career or your own insights, how did you end up standing on the precipice of trying to reinvent the ERP?
There's like 3 acts to this. So the first is like just grew up in the Midwest, grew up in Illinois. My dad worked in big auto. He worked for a supplier for multiple automotive companies. He worked on the convertible top for the Mitsubishi Lancer. He worked on the high mounts rear stop lamp on the Ford F-150. He worked on fog lamps. Like he worked on a bunch of random stuff, right? And so my understanding of like what it means to be an engineer and like what he did and then ultimately what I ended up going and studying was like you make physical stuff. Even throughout my childhood, I understood that there was a operational footprint that was really connected to the physical things that you had to go do to make products. And he would tell me things were like, oh, we got this system called JD Edwards. We're paying millions of dollars for it. And it's, I don't want to swear, but you can imagine how he was about that stuff. And like I was 12 and I didn't understand, but it kind of stuck in the back of my mind that he would say a lot of these things about how finance and accounting and the workflows downstream of their business would actually impact their ability to deliver a product. That was something that never really left me. Years go by, I'm living in China, working in manufacturing, working with some small companies. There was like a 10-person team I worked on where we were actually sharing the same factory and line space as iRobot, the people who make the Roombas. And we would get to a point where we were actually trying to procure material, and the people that were running the system at this contract manufacturer, they'd be like, oh, we can't run the material report until Wednesday. And we're like, okay, why not? What's the problem? And they're like, oh, well, it just doesn't run until Wednesday. And I was like, what do you mean it doesn't run until Wednesday? And that was like the first moment in my career where I was like, wait, I thought this was all solved. I thought you go into an airport and you see the ads about digital transformation. You see the guys walking around in the warehouses with the iPads and they're all pointing at stuff and charts. And I was like, oh, this is all fake. Like none of that's real. And when I realized that, I was like, oh, there's a whole opportunity here to go like solve a bunch of problems that are still not solved. And seeing that now translate into, what we saw for our customers, that was kind of like the jumping off point for me. It turns out that the companies I'd been working at were not the only people experiencing this. I worked at a really small company. I went and worked with some of the best contract manufacturers in Asia and Taiwan, working on security cameras, all kinds of different things. They had the exact same sets of problems. And so I was like, okay, this not only is this not an uncommon, anomalous thing, but it's common, and it's common among the best companies. Therefore, the median, average business must really struggle with this stuff, right? That was the genesis and like how we kind of got to wanting to work on the problem more clearly. And what we do today is we really focus on the flow of goods, the flow of dollars, and the flow of data into and out of a business's context and like their footprint of what they manage, who they manage. That's really what we consider to be in our scope of work.
So some people would have gone to the best contract manufacturer in the world, seen they're struggling with these problems, and concluded that it wasn't possible to solve them. How did you get to the point of conviction? Like, what was your process even, internally to get to the point of conviction where you're like, oh yeah, actually, I know something that the rest of the world and the hundreds of thousands of software engineers who have worked on, this problem previously were overlooking.
For a long time, I didn't think there was an answer. I just was like, I kind of was resigned to, I was like, well, 95% of my job as an electrical engineer is going to end up being program management. I'm going to be going line by line through spreadsheets for the rest of my life. And like, that's just the reality. And I didn't love doing that, but I knew how to go do it. And I worked with people who were good at doing these things. It just required a lot of willpower to like go and kind of like force the world to bend to your needs, to go and build products and to get things shipped to the places they're supposed to go to and make sure documentation's correct so that your stuff doesn't get rejected at customs and so that you have enough material to run the build and whatever it is. But then I started seeing a lot of stuff that was happening with generative AI. And the simple answer that I came up with is like, okay, I think it was just GPT-2 when I first saw it, that someone was using it to write SQL queries in plain English. They were saying, hey, I want to go and query these things and go and, write me the correct query that correctly selects the columns, does the correct filtering and the correct joins and grouping. And I saw it do that. And I was like, oh, it's like, okay, this is going to get a lot better. And when it gets a lot better, we're going to be able to take all of the unstructured data and all of the core primitives of like what I do in my day-to-day of synthesizing information, synthesizing context, and then distilling it down into one kernel of insight, and then applying that back into a system of record. We can take this flywheel that normally spins in businesses, which is the entropy is, constantly evolving, things are happening, and you have to go and collect all the data artifacts that are getting tossed off of the system. You're like kind of cleaning them up. There's a scene in Wall-E where there's a robot going behind Wall-E and cleaning up after him. If you've ever seen that. And that's what it reminds me of, is like this little robot going and cleaning everything up as the real world progresses and propagates. And I was like, okay, like if we can get machines to do a lot of that work, the act of maintaining systems and the act of implementing systems is actually to get a lot easier. And the act of implementing systems a lot of times now, and when we think about it inside of DOS, was like, if we can prompt our way into configuring a system, like, you have a new warehouse that you're bringing online in the EU. You say, I have the Shopify integration, and it's just a big text file that defines the configuration of how that integration works. I need to go in and update it so that when orders that come in with like this set of parameters, maybe like the locations or the different types, the locations and addresses of the customers, route those to this other workflow instead of the main workflow. And then those are going to go to our 3PL. That's something that, because everything gets compiled down inside of our product in the text-based configuration, people can prompt their way to the right answer and to actually modify the underlying business logic of the product in plain English. And that was pretty evident to me from day one, that like there are going to be so many products that go that direction, basically as the models improve. And that was kind of the unlock. I was like, well, there's a lot of core product we have to go and build in order to get to a place where we can use AI effectively to go and build the system itself. We're still early. I think there's a handful of companies that are really trying to pioneer stuff like this. Like honestly, Zapier has done a fantastic job of like, you write a prompt in English and it spits out a workflow, right? Our thing about that is like, why can't I just do that so that someone can build me a procurement workflow instead and have a native connection into our data model, PDF generation, payments, invoicing, all that stuff. So we're just thinking a couple steps down the line.
I really like that analogy. And I guess just in terms of like the company's history, you said you're early on, but what did it look like to get the team together, and how long have you been working on this?
Yeah, we started working on it in October of 2022. I wouldn't raise money right away. There were two things that were apparent. Number one, it would take a long time to build. There were two, I needed to be thoughtful about what order to do things. And the rationale here is like, you've probably seen this with other companies, or you've talked to other people who've done the same thing. It's really easy to build yourself into a corner with these types of B2B applications. You can say, I'm going to go and build a very clear wedge where I go and address this one problem. And you do a great job at that, and you expand and work with all your customers, and they go up market. And then your best customers come to you and say, hey, like actually we need to churn off of your product because we're going to move on to NetSuite. We're going to move on to some larger system that's going to subsume your system, and we don't really need you anymore. And because you're not that comprehensive platform, there's no reason for us to keep working with this. We didn't want to be in that position by building into a wedge and then kind of like cornering ourselves, which meant building a lot of product, which meant raising a decent amount of money, and then almost like kind of calling your shot. And because this had been a problem I kind of been thinking about for a while, it was relatively easy for us to outline that. I think a much harder thing to do, as opposed to just like raising the money and starting the company, has been being really disciplined at not wanting to take the shortcuts. Like all those apps come out over the last 2 years where they're like, chat with your whatever and chat with your PDFs and all that. And like people who are doing very simple OCR on PDFs to convert them into documents and take unstructured data and all that. Like, we're just trying to take as long-term of a point of view about building a platform as possible and not take any hacky shortcuts to just like sign a couple contracts or something. And that just requires a lot of discipline, honestly. When it's like sitting there in front of you and like you see a bunch of people just like slapping AI on something and then like being like, here's a $100,000 contract. It's pretty hard to resist that in an effort to maintain your focus and focus on building the exactly correct thing, which we believe will have real business value over the long run.
As a sort of a fellow founder, I feel the same urges every day to try to just ship the thing and feel the gratification of seeing someone use it and get paid for it. But yeah, it's a hard thing to resist. Where did the name Doss come from, by the way? Sidebar, but just curious.
It's funny and it has nothing to do with what we do. Our office is in San Francisco, and the name of the company was actually something different when we started it. When I incorporated, I was like, I just need to come up with a name for something so that we can get, have an actual corporation, open a bank account, all that stuff. And I started the name as Odonata Inc. It's just Latin for dragonfly, which is, I think, actually a much more interesting name because dragonflies are funny. They spend like 90% of their life as like a larva. They don't mature until the very end of their life. But this insanely incredible, agile hunter, they can change their orientation on a dime. They're these incredible creatures, but it takes so long for them to get to that point. And I always thought that was like a fun metaphor for what we're doing. But no one could say that. And so we would be like, Odonata. They'd be like, what? Odana? Tanata? What? So we changed it. We looked for a cheeky 4-letter name, something short. And there was a Ross, like the clothing store next to our office. And I would walk by it every day. And I was like, oh, one day I got off the bus and I was like, Ross, Doss. And then I went and looked for the domain. There was some guy in Missouri who had the domain since the 90s and I bought it from him. And that was it.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah, it's funnier than it is interesting.
It's very interesting. I mean, even just having the metaphor of the dragonfly in your mind from the very beginning is really cool. And I guess just to quickly circle back on that other question, who was the team and how did you get the gang together to build this thing?
Honestly, complete serendipity, like total pure luck. So my co-founder and I talked about this a lot, that like we used up all of our luck on like day one. And like you get like a check that you get to write in terms of the amount of luck that you can cash in as a founder or people starting a company. And we used up like all of ours meeting each other. It was just pure luck. His background is that he had been a software engineer at multiple startups. He had seen like on-prem security for data centers, whole product around that. He'd worked in construction billing. He'd built a bunch of integrations with like Oracle products where they'd like hack through, not backdoors, but like, completely like not okay methods for integrating with Oracle products. And he was like, these ERPs are insane. He was like, we should just go build a new one. And I got connected with him. We had gone to the same university. I knew of him. He knew of me. We had met a couple of times before. And like one of our mutual friends and one of our investors was able to connect us. And it was like perfect timing. We met one time and I told him what I wanted to work on. He was like, yep, I'm in. Like, sounds good. It was just like a lights out thing. He's like, this makes sense, and I think both of us are very high intuition in terms of the way we think, as opposed to being like really analytical. Like neither of us are very methodical and analytical. We're very like, when something feels right, we go for it. And we kind of have to do a lot of fuzzy pattern matching in our gut. And we talked about the problem. And then we were like, all right, let's think of all the reasons not to do this. And we couldn't think of any. And so we did it. And so then from there, it was, been a slow roll. We've been bringing more people onto the team. It's mostly engineering, a couple other folks helping out in other areas. But there's 10 of us as of today. We actually brought 3 more people on Monday. So there were 7 up until that. But we've been around for about 20 months now.
Cool. And congrats on the new hires. That's totally amazing that just came together like that. I guess it was meant to be.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So I want to start diving in a little bit more on the product because I think there are different altitudes we can sort of take this at. But maybe just for someone who's like familiar with an ERP or even like familiar with the idea of an ERP, as you alluded to, the problem is so real. Businesses need a source of truth for their business context so they can make decisions. In practice, nobody likes using their ERP. They take forever to implement. They're not fun to use, et cetera. From a user's perspective, like how do you move from that paradigm to something new? What do people hate about using their ERP? Like where is it breaking now? And like what are the sort of product innovations that you are working on to fix that?
I'll preface this with like a little bit more about the customers we actually serve, because I think there's an assumption hidden in some of the things that you said that I want to directly address because it's really important, which is that we don't really sell that much to people who already have a system in place. And we're not in the business of migrating customers from very large scale implementations today. It's not something that we have the capability to do today. We would like to be able to do it in the future, but we don't really right now. And the rationale is that, like, if you think about what kind of games you want to choose to play and what are the rules of those, we don't want to be involved in trying to change people's behaviors and change their sense of identity about who they are and what they do. And I'm sure if you go look at many companies that have been around for decades, you're going to have people who work at that company who are like, I'm an SAP payroll specialist, or I'm a whatever. And like, their sense of purpose in their job function is tied to the software that they use and they've been using for a long time. And they've made a lot of investments, not just in terms of like dollars that they've paid these companies to implement, but truly even like the personnel that they've hired over the years and the tribal knowledge and tacit knowledge that's accumulated. We don't want to try to unravel all that. That would be really, really hard.
I just want to clarify. It's funny that you say that because my bias in the question is actually coming from the perspective of like a mid-market operator, like of the type of person who is in startups. And I think a lot of these folks, it's almost the opposite of that, where like maybe they have an idea of what an ERP is, or they've used an ERP at a previous role, and they feel the pain of, not having a system of record, but they know they don't want an ERP, or they're putting it off for as long as possible because they know that pain. So how do you convince someone who like wants the value but doesn't want the pain to take the plunge?
So if we kind of keep cross-sectioning further and like almost like imagine like we're carving off pieces and shaping off like possible segments of customers, we've like almost completely removed the group of people who are in that camp I was talking about, where they're like, business that's been around for a while that has systems. Let's rule them out as people we even want to go and try and help. Because I don't fully believe this, but I try to joke about with our team. I'm like, I don't really believe in reform. I don't think many institutions can be reformed. I think you kind of have to like trial by fire, burn the whole thing down and build it back up. And I think that's a lot of times ends up being true with these kinds of organizations. And so what we do is we go and find people who have seen the burning down phase of some kind of company, and they are in some sort of business now where they're like, I am putting off, exactly like you said, an implementation for as long as humanly possible. And I'm using my understanding of how to model data, how to model business processes to get away with using consumer grade tools and stretching them to their limits. And we've worked with companies who are like, using Airtable and running an 80 mil top line business on Airtable, where they have a database of their product catalog that has 500 unique fields in it in one Airtable database, which is insane. It's extremely impressive that they do that, but they are trying as hard as they humanly can and using as much ingenuity to not implement these systems. And so eventually they realize that in order to concretely solidify a business process so that other people can take it and run with it without having the deep tribal knowledge about how the system's acceptance work, they have to go and implement it in some form of ERP. Usually people that come to us and the people that we talk to, they have been looking for a way out. It's like, they're cornered and we're just like kind of building them a bridge to where they need to go. And that's really the perspective I give to them. It's like, we understand very deeply that they have a nuanced business that is not adequately captured by consumer grade tools. And it's also cost prohibitive and time prohibitive for them to go and try and implement some large scale system from a partner that doesn't like really understand their business. And so we just try to thread the needle and show them that we can deeply understand their business and move really quickly to give them an end-to-end workflow with intrinsic business value, which is basically like, I need to be able to do these core operational tasks end to end and have all the data objects and data artifacts sit inside of DOS. And, we do that with order management, with procurement, inventory management, even now working with invoicing, sending out order tracking to customers. And so it's very incremental. We build up workflows over time. We don't do like the big bang, lift and shift, like move 100 people onto a new system in one day and it go live and flip the switch and stuff. We really roll things out stage by stage.
Take us through maybe sort of the architecture of the product. I realize you have a bunch of different use cases, you have a bunch of different user types, maybe even like a case study of a customer you worked with recently, like who needed this and what did the process of kind of getting that first foot in the door look like from an implementation standpoint?
Implementation and selling, I look at as almost the same thing. Like I treat them very similarly because I want to be able to convince people of the real business value they get on the other side of what we're building or what we can deliver to them before they have to sign a dotted line and, like they can say, especially with if you go and buy something from a larger software vendor that's out there today, they'll be like, oh yeah, 8 months from now you can start using it, whatever it is, and it'll be customized to meet all your needs, and like you'll work with our ProServe team or whatever it is. So we don't do any of that. Instead, what we do is we just say, hey, look, hand us all of the data, like Marie Kondo, like the Netflix thing, where it's like if it doesn't spark joy, throw it out, right? We do the same thing with their data objects. We say, okay, send us all of the like hard collateral documents you generate, and I call them artifacts. If you generate PDFs for anything, then you send it to your customers or vendors, you keep it internally, send it to us. If you create Excel files for anything and like track information in any spreadsheet or any existing system, just dump it all out and send it to us.
When you say send, you mean like include you, like CC you guys on the email basically, or share you on the spreadsheet?
That's exactly right. We think it's way faster for people to just dump and throw everything at us, and then we can reconstitute it ourselves, as opposed to trying to put the system on rails. And it's because it's too nuanced to be put on rails almost every single time. When you have done enough of the pattern matching, it's actually pretty easy for us to be like, okay, a furniture business and a CPG company, if you look at the underlying structure of their data models, they're almost identical. Like it's like someone has orders, maybe they have quotes, maybe they have purchase orders that go to their vendors. Their vendors can sometimes serve as warehouses, as well as sometimes they actually use them as customers, because sometimes they'll even sell through their vendors or something. All of these intricacies and the interconnections of their data model, it's really apparent once you just like dump everything out. And then we really just show them what the model of what their business really looks like is. We build the workflows that stitch everything together, and we putting a mirror in front of them and like, hey, this is what you're going to get. And like, this is what we have. We'll put together a statement of work of what, really the tangible work product is at the end. And then we just execute against it. And so selling in that case really turns into implementation. And we definitely face things, so there's some stuff that's like, they're like, hey, we want to, have this more complex set of workflows. We'll be like, that's not really like the foundational thing that you need today. So we'll get there. But like over time, really common example in terms of like a starting place is really just like aggregating orders. Order management is a huge pain point for so many of these customers. And so aggregating orders across e-commerce and wholesale, and then connecting that back into their product catalog, and then connecting that back into how they do procurement. Those are really like the three big buckets of like places we usually start.
And so once someone is sort of given you over their data so that you can build the model, I guess you have some way of continuously ingesting that going forward as well?
Yeah. So our product breaks down into three things. I can explain these in terms of like comparable products is like the easiest way. We basically have a database product, which is kind of a wrapper on top of SQL, and it's really similar to Airtable. We have a workflow product, which is a big flowchart workflow execution system that's got different types of steps and triggers, and it can connect into third-party data sources and write out to third-party data sources. It's basically just a carbon copy of a lot of the concepts of Zapier. And then we have an interfaces product, which is like a lot of the drag and drop editor of forms so that people can edit data and update data on Rails with conditional validation, error handling, things like that, in an environment that has all that. And then charting and visualization. And so if you kind of roll it all up, it's like we're combining like the Retoolish, Google Forms, Zapier, Airtable things, and then passing it all through the prism of what someone needs specifically for operational workflows, as opposed to like just like, hey, here's this general purpose tool that you can use for literally anything. To then, kind of tie it back to what you're asking about, once we have like the structure of their tables together, once we have the structure of like how the workflows will function, once we have the initial sets of forms and the files that those will go generate, once those are all stitched together, they're going to actually be using our product to generate data. And so they're not going to be generating it in whatever they were doing before, if it's like Sheets or whatever it is. And then if there's a new system that they need to bring online, that's like, let's say, they have a new web store. Let's say they're going to go and start selling on Faire. They're going to start selling wholesale through Faire. Well, we would say, well, we need a new workflow that will run and pull data out of Faire whenever you have orders and merge it in with your orders table, which is already bringing in data from Shopify, and it's already bringing in data from SPS Commerce and, whatever, Amazon. And so our integrations and the continuous integration ends up looking like just building more workflows, as opposed to being like, they're not going to come to us and be like, hey, we need an integration for X. Can you integrate with X? We just say, well, if there's the ability for us to connect to that data source programmatically, then yes, it's always the answer. If the answer is no, then the question is like, how can we do something that's kind of close to a programmatic connection? Whether it be like they upload data regularly, or maybe they even put a CSV file in an FTP that we will go look at periodically, again, using a workflow, which will run on a schedule and be like, hey, go look at this FTP file, grab the CSV out, parse the data, map it to the tables, insert the records. We're kind of building these workflows that can function as integrations.
Right. That makes sense. And you've seen all these sort of consumer products. Airtable started out as the database, now trying to do forms and, that kind of thing. Zapier started as the workflows, now trying to do Airtable as well. It's okay, but it's clearly not like what they were natively built to do.
Yeah, that's actually a point that I've made so many times to our team internally, is that if you look carefully at Airtable, Zapier, and Retool, they are really interesting because the three of those companies have built one another's products, but like in a triangle where like they each started from a different place and then they went and built one another's things. That means that there's something important about interfaces, a data store, and workflows. And like, if you pay attention to like even computing, like the OSI model and various things, but like the MVC, the model view controller, there's something very fundamental about the data layer abstraction and then the workflow execution that connects those two things together. That's kind of all you need. And there's a bunch of other peripheral stuff that's really important that you want to make easy. But once you build those core things and give them very, very good contextual data model awareness between one another, you can do a bunch of really cool stuff. The reason building all three of them at the same time is so important is that then you can do a ton of validation and prevent customers from breaking stuff. So like the reason that we like talking about this is we have this thing that we do internally called triumvirate. It's basically the ability that when you take something in a form and you like add a new form field or you add a new option, like, hey, I want to make it so that FedEx can be shipped. And it turns out that the table that you're writing into with this form doesn't have that as an option. Like the table needs to know and the workflow needs to know that the form just added something that those things can't support. And you have to have this big graph that sits underneath all of your data objects and looks at the links that are being created and then runs real-time validation and says, hey, you just created a new thing that doesn't exist in these other places. If someone runs this workflow, it's going to break. And so we built a whole system that handles all that. But that's a lot harder to do if you don't build all three of those things at the same time. It was one of our core insights, I think, when we were building the product early on. We're like, oh, you have to have all three at once. They can't exist independently from one another.
It totally makes sense. And it's such a huge product surface area. I think that the conversation that I was having, with people even 5 years ago, well, you can't do it. You never get the company out in time for all that product to work well together. And I guess we've come a long way since then.
Yeah. GPT has helped a ton. I have to give credit where it's due, for sure.
Yeah. So it sounds like today your implementation/sales process is fairly hands-on. I guess two-part question. Ever able to sort of fully hand off to the customer, or is this something you're happy to sort of continue helping with over time? And then like long-term, as the company gets more mature, as you're able to build, better onboarding, like is there a world where it is on rails and someone can just pop this open and start doing it themselves?
I don't think it's a linear continuum. There's a spectrum to two things. There's a spectrum to the capability of our users. And then there's a spectrum to how hard the thing they're trying to do is. And it's almost like bimodal. And like it's, if you've heard like a barbell distribution, like it's either really, really easy or it's really, 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 really hard. And like there's not a lot of stuff that's in the middle. Like it's mostly just like something that's so hard that only we can like have to think about it and understand if there's product surface area that supports that, if it's an elegant way of doing it, if it's really hacky and maybe we can build a feature that helps hack it in, or if that's even a good idea or not. Those are things we like to think about. And then some stuff we're like, yeah, of course, we should give our users the ability to do that because like it's really simple for them to understand how to do that. Now, there are some users that we work with that like have the ability to traverse over into our area of thinking. But I think we're really selective about not trying to put stuff in the middle. It's like either we put it in the really hard bucket and we make ourselves do it, or we put it in the really easy bucket and make it so that users can do it. We don't do stuff in the middle mostly. And the rationale for that is it's a forcing function on building a really great user experience or building perfect abstractions. And like, for example, right now, we don't have the ability for our users to build forms themselves. And the reason we haven't done that is because form builders are not that complex in terms of like, we know what we need to go build. It's just like something we have to go and work on. But we can build forms super fast for our customers. We have templates and stuff, and they'll be like, hey, I need these 5 types of forms. We go, okay, sounds good. We'll have them to you in like literally 20 minutes. Versus we give those controls over to our users. They might just go change a bunch of stuff, and then we have to go and fix it for them at some point and debug that. Yeah, once we build a full form builder that has like lots of validation and like a really great user experience so that it's hard for them to make mistakes, then sure, we should go ship that. And we're actually working on that right now. But it wasn't a priority for us to go and build. So that's kind of what you even said earlier on around like, it seems like it's too big of a product surface area to work on. It felt like that for a long time. But our fix for it has been just being really disciplined about what we choose to do ourselves and what we choose to let our users do.
It's a really thoughtful way of piecing that together. I've got a great sense of the product now. To zoom back out again, and like from your perch talking to modern supply chain operators and looking at sort of the field, how do you see things evolving in terms of, the software stack for an operator looks like? Is it in 5 years from now, everyone's going to be running a DOS or a DOS competitor and that's going to be the default? Or is there still a world where there's some degree of modularity and people are sort of picking and choosing and stringing solutions together, but just in a different way? How do you see that landscape evolving?
To kind of like wind the clock back a bit, like I think when talking about like what's going to happen in the future, I think it's just so important to level set on what actually occurred in the past. And if we look all the way at the beginning of like, when did these systems start getting implemented? they all started not that dissimilar away from what we're trying to do today, where they originally began as like taking ownership of a couple of core business processes, and then they realized they could turn it into a platform. And then the platform gets unbundled into like these very specific pieces that then all get repackaged back up. And you got like the best of breed solutions that came about in the 90s. And then eventually, like, you had NetSuite in like 1998 that was like, oh, let's build this all in the cloud. And, the pendulum just swings back and forth, back and forth in terms of the high level trends. You always have outliers where like some businesses, like the Amazons and like Tesla, where they're like, we're just going to build it all ourselves. No external stuff. Everything we're going to build, we're going to put it in house. And then you have other companies where you're like, looking at the GE and Procter and Gamble as like famous examples of running these massive multi-billion-dollar big Oracle, like I can't remember what the product was called, like Business Studio or 11 or something. I don't remember what it was. But anyway, so where we think this goes is that like the tools that are coming out today are all pretty much betting on users' capabilities going up as a result of AI making people better at doing things and making it so that you can interact with the underlying primitives of them programmatically. In this scenario, it'd be like prompting your way towards creating workflows and kind of forging your interface and your instance of whatever tool you have. We think that is also going to be what happens. And so our position over the long run is we want to be a really great place for companies that are starting to choose to put their system of record inside of DOS for their operational data. I think if you look at companies like AWS as an example, like you're like the subset of the product AWS, they did not try to go and convince GE or Blockbuster from day one to lift and shift all of their data onto AWS. Instead, they said, hey, Netflix, like you don't need to own your own infrastructure. You can build it on AWS, right? We look at this the same way with new companies. We just want to be the best place for new businesses to be built when they're thinking about taking their operational footprint and putting it into a platform. And what that means is as these businesses grow, they're going to want more developer level capabilities. They're going to want the ability to package up DOS and run it themselves and modularize it and run it on their own infrastructure. And that's something that we absolutely want to support. We think in the long run, the best version of DOS is that we're indistinguishable from many of the other infrastructure companies that are out there. It's just that I think our entry point to it is not through like building developer tools, but for serving end business user needs.
That makes sense. And you guys have made a lot of progress so far. Is there anything that keeps you up at night? Like, what are you worried about potentially in the future in terms of roadblocks or things that could as yet become stumbling blocks to this company being successful?
It changes every like few months when you like break through certain stages of the work. I think like probably 6 months ago, my biggest concern was like, can we just like reliably get ourselves in front of these companies? And are there enough people who are optimistic about a different way of doing things? Like I said, if they're cornered and I'm giving them this path and this way out, are people going to take that? And we found the answer is yes. And so like that doesn't keep me up anymore. Now it's like, things like we're now trying to go into situations and actually command contract values that we think is correlated with the value that we're delivering. It's like, are people bought in on the value proposition? If not, what do we need to go build to make sure they really are as we go and try to get larger contracts? That's like very company focused. In terms of like the actual product surface area, there's not a ton that worries me. The stuff that worries me is more like, are we going fast enough? And it's like the very standard thing where like you see these shiny demos that, like a good example is Sonnet 3.5 came out, right? And I'm sure you've probably seen some of these demos. And by the time, I'm sure a few months from now, if anyone's listening to this, they'll be like, oh, that thing wasn't even that good, right? Like the pace at which those things are accelerating is blowing my mind. And I can see the concentric circles getting drawn around the foundational models. And there will be a point where they start to clip and start they start bumping into the business process management tools where like, maybe you don't even need to use Google Sheets for certain things anymore at all. You can just like GPT everything. Maybe you don't need to use like a plugin for like a email writer or a CRM or whatever. How good do those tools get? And are we moving fast enough to take advantage of the changes that are occurring underneath our feet? Because everyone else is. And so, yeah, that's a real concern. I think when I originally looked at how good these tools would get, I bet on the rising tides. They might just be rising so fast that we all drown. And I mean, we as in like B2B software companies. So was it the rising tide lifts all boats? But rising tides also drown people. So are you in a boat or are you drowning? I don't know. So that's where I'm kind of like, I don't know the answer. And so the pragmatic perspective is just like, go as fast as you possibly can.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I, as much as you, hope not to end up in the permanent AI underclass, but yet to be seen where we all end up in a couple of years.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Well, I think we're running up on time here, but I just wanted to say thank you again, Wiley. It's been awesome to explore this with you. We are going to set up a verified page for Doss. We'll link that in the show notes, as well as anything else we've mentioned here. And thanks for listening.
Thanks, Charles. Appreciate it.
Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Blue Ocean. Blue Ocean is produced by StartOps, a growing collection of resources for operations leaders at e-commerce brands. A few of the things we built include a growing, vendor-free Slack community for operators to ask their most important questions and get answers from trusted peers, a job board that curates jobs from 1,500 modern brands, a media hub that includes this podcast as well as articles and templates on a variety of operations topics, and a comprehensive directory of the software and services used by our community members. If you want to learn more, head to startops.network. And to keep up with the latest information from StartOps, or catch the most recent episodes of Blue Ocean, follow the StartOps page on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks for listening and hope to catch you next episode.